Hello and welcome to Exit Pursued by Podcast, theatre history podcast where we discuss all the minutiae of the theatre world. I'm your host Evey Wylde, and today I'm joined by a repeat guest. We have Tom Jancis.
Hello Evie, thank you for having me.
Thank you. I didn't fuck up your name. I nearly did.
As I said, where I think I exasperate people where they're like, is it Jancis? Is it Jancis? Is it Janus? And I'm like, yes.
All of the above.
I'm trying to remember if I said on this one where I always feel like I'm going, one of those shibboleth words where you're like, what is your name? I'm like, go off a cornflake packet. I don't know. Anyway, yes, thanks for having me back, Evie. I really enjoyed doing it last time. I enjoyed listening to it. And excited to come back and start gushing about another one of my passions.
Yes. So last time I asked you to be on the first episode because I wanted to talk to someone who also shared an interest in theatre ghosts. But that subject was my choice. This one is your choice. Do you want to tell us about what it is?
Sure. We today will be talking about immersive or interactive theatre, and the fact that I'm using both terms is to some people a bit of a sticking point. I think coming at things from the academic point of view that we both have an interest in, the minutiae of like what's site specific, what's immersive, interactive. I think we might even get into like sort of invisible theatre, and there's a sort of discussion of like, is it really a theatrical experience if no one's aware that they're watching? And of course the fun of like the silent disco, travelling the streets, and you go, is this theatre or is this just an inconvenience?
It can be both.
Why not both?
Cool. So we're going to start at the beginning as a definition of what is interactive or immersive theatre. What does that mean?
Well, again, I hesitate here because a lot of people try and work out what the origin is. That's sort of how far do you want to go back? Do we go back to the idea of like heckling in theatre? Like I said, like you've talked about Shakespeare, that there is this section in Hamlet where he asks, "Who calls me coward?" And people are like, we kind of expect the audience to yell at Hamlet, and then when he comes back and he's like, "Hey, no, I do what I do," you know that great Shakespearean quote of "I do what I do." But as we said, we go back even like sort of in the Elizabethan times where people like climb on stage. There's an infamous story. I want to say this is later. Infamous story about a lord sitting on one side of the stage, seeing his friend crossing, and then one of the actors attacking him and killing him. And then they're just like, oh, we have to shut the theatre for a bit. There's been a murder.
Oh, God. Accidental performance art. That's the question.
Which would have been great, like, say, if it's the 16th century. Like, this is performance art. Yes, but you did murder the Earl of Salisbury, so...
Is this how you spot a time traveller?
Yes.
Try to use the old performance art excuse before it's invented.
And then they sort of say that, and Kit Marlowe just like, dude, you got to keep it quiet. You're like, sweet Kit, part of this conspiracy. Yes, so going back to that, we were talking before we started recording about like Brechtian style theatre, that Brecht wanted theatre to be like in a drinking hall. He describes the best kind of theatre being the description of someone having seen a car crash. And if we now watch a lot of Brecht, a lot of it ends with him just going, well, I don't have an ending. And the only way we can get an ending is from you. You go out and fix things. But what I would like to say, this is the origin of what I'm considering to be like interactive or immersive, is the happenings of the 1960s. I'll get a little bit into why I'm doing what I'm doing and what my experiences were. But when I was starting, what I was introduced to for the first immersive play I wrote was Richard Schechner's Dionysus in '69. So that was, as I said, the happenings of the 1960s in New York, everything being very sort of like, oh, we're hanging out in this old warehouse, which again, if you go see immersive theatre, we love a warehouse.
Oh, yeah.
It's one of the few things we could get hold of. And that was a modern retelling of the Bacchae, and Dionysus basically trying to seduce the king. Again, it was the 60s. There was a lot of nudity. There was a lot of people climbing on each other and getting up from the audience.
The 60s.
The 60s. So there's a couple of really fun examples of this. There is a section where the Bacchae obviously kill the king. That's the way the story ends. There was one production where the audience said, we don't want that. And they literally kidnapped him and dragged him off and literally got in a fist fight going, we're going to protect him. And Dionysus was like, well, I can't finish this play now.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And then another one where he's like, the king is all stuck up and obviously needs some sex, I don't suppose anyone would. And one woman in the audience was like, I will. And they were like, oh. And so the two of them went off, and literally Dionysus read, well, for the first time in 2,000 years, I appear to have lost. And then someone kicked over a chair, and it turned into a fist fight again.
Yeah. What fourth wall?
Yes, for those of you who don't know, it was these sort of very pop-up kind of experimental art. Again, lots of stuff in warehouses, lots of drinking, lots of, which actually, I'm sure we'll get back to later, alcohol. Alcohol seems to be one of the major backbones of immersive theatre, that trying to make it where people are like, oh yeah, no, we'll happily give you the space. You'll let us take the bar though, and you will convince them to drink, which gets into the idea of like accessibility. I've always sort of said that's the thing that people claim, that immersive theatre is accessible. And I was like, well, can you get around it? You know, in a wheelchair or on a stick. There's a lot of standing, there's a lot of moving, and there's a lot of drinking. And then people are like, well, yes. Which also now gets into the thing with immersive, where a lot of it is put on the shoulders of the audience, but you also need a certain amount of trust that you know that the performers also will care for you, will protect you, aren't there to embarrass you. But also, I've got a lot of friends who work in immersive theatre but hate going to it because they're like, I don't want to talk to people.
I feel that. I'm going to crack my host whip
Please
and
do.
bring you back to what we were talking about, which was the origins and the history. Yes. I have a few points.
Please.
So in my research, I found that potentially one of the starting points that is often cited as the beginning of the immersive movement was when it was under a different name, which was mainly Theatre of the Oppressed.
Yes, the sort of, as I said, the theatre of the oppressed. Again, like I said, a bit like with the Brechtian, that kind of like, it's very funny. It, unfortunately, something that was very, well, political and very biting has become a bit like, oh, we're going to go outside and like cause mischief. And you're like, especially in England, where people are like, just get out of the road. That's
something very interesting about interactive theatre to me, is that it began life as something innately political, especially with Theatre of the Oppressed and Brecht, where it was considered the primary purpose of it to break the fourth wall, bring the spectators, to make them spect-actors in the action, to make them complicit, to further political agendas. Additionally, the first instance I found on Wikipedia, no less, as well as a couple academic articles that I will link, was in Soviet Russia, where they used interactive street theatre to spread news about the war efforts and war propaganda, which was, I did not expect it in Soviet Russia.
Yes, the sort of, I want to say Kandinsky, but that sort of pop-up kind of style. I'm trying to remember the name of the show now. I want to say it was a marriage, but it was on in London, which was very much that idea of, it was a oppressive regime, and we are all gathered to come see a wedding, and we're like, what a lovely wedding it is. Johnny Lee Miller was in it, and he's like, I'm officiating, and great. And then it was like, oh, we're having a wonderful time. Right, they're gone. Right, so we have a play for you, which was kind of unfortunate because it was in Trafalgar Studios, which is a kind of big thing. I was like, my God, if this was in some kind of like back warehouse kind of space where we were actually like, cool, right, tear things down, let's get it to go. And then that would be like, we would be partway through, and then we'd hear a knock on the door, and we'll have to stand up and be like, and we're singing a song, and everything's like, yes, but that same sort of idea of, as you said, sort of more sort of underground, hidden, like interactive, but also that, like when people did mummies plays, which again, I've done mummery, but the idea of you were masked because you don't want people to know who you are, because you're being a bit difficult and a bit like a little bit rude to the church. And also every prop you have, you could argue was something, you know, you're using a broom as a sword, and then so when the guards come in, you're like, oh no, by the way, I'm just sweeping the floor, everything's fine. That idea of being very slightly ramshackle, but like there's a beauty in that, and being like I said, like especially in Soviet Russia, where you would just be like, slightly off topic, but my parents, because my father's father was Latvian, but let's say the war was not easy for Latvia, and a lot of people went missing. Ollie Murs, the singer, was on like a Who Do You Think You Are thing, and they were looking into his family, who were Latvian circus performers.
Ooh.
And I think his great-great-grandfather had an affair with the trapeze artist, and then this child turned up, and she went, yeah, I'm not going to take care of it, and sort of handed over. But then the fact was that she sort of disappeared, and people were like, we don't know what happened. And they're like, what we think is that she was in Russia at a cafe and someone said something and she argued with it. And then she disappeared for 14 years. She just got sent to the Russian gulag, and that...
Good Lord.
So,
that's a hefty thing to come out in a TV show.
Yeah, but sometimes it's sort of like, oh, it turns out your great great grandfather ran a milk float, and then, but then I think it was for her, it was like Stalin died, and then they were just like, oh, we've got all these people, I guess we'll let them go. But getting back to the point
Yes.
where good that you brought this up because I'm like, oh yeah, this was the fun the 1960s stuff, and you're like, no, the actual political, sort of to attack the inaction of people, and I think honestly this is so important. This shows the importance of art. You're like, we all know that if we get caught doing this, we're going to be sent to the gulag for 14 years, but we still need to. And to be able to, like, as you said, like, spread the war information and be like, this is what happened.
It was actually on the side of the government.
The government?
Yes.
Oh my God, I was supporting the government this entire time.
It was pro-Soviet to spread news to people who could not read.
It makes sense when you come in and you're just like, hello, everything's going well. And now a dance.
And now the end of the show, it's like a 2010s kids movie.
More theatre needs to be like the end of something at the Globe where everyone just comes in and goes, and now the jig.
It's lovely.
Yeah.
Oh, you could say that the 2010s animated kid movies are doing that tradition.
And you know what? And let's go on the record and let's say it. Yeah. Again, actually, I think that's a really interesting thing of like getting into like the metatextuality of even the bad guy who was trying to shut down the orphanage is having a dance in his prison cell. No one's dead. Everyone's fine. We've taken off the masks and go, don't worry, kids. We saved the youth centre. Yes.
Sorry, bit sidetracked. So
Yes.
we've gone to where it started, very political roots. What does interactive theatre look like to date? Has it retained any of this politicalisation, or is it more kind of mainstream narratives?
Interesting. I would argue a lot of the politics has come out of it. Sort of interactive, immersive, site-specific. It's all become terms which is good for marketing. For example, I went to Ralph Fiennes was doing Macbeth. Apologies, audience, for most of this being London or like Edinburgh-centric, but that's what I see. And they're like, oh, it's an immersive Macbeth. And I was like, oh, that's going to be interesting. What it was is you walked in, there was like a bit of like fake dirt, a burnt out truck. You walked through that bit. You then went, sat in your seat. Maybe the witches went and sat in the audience occasionally.
Oh,
but that's immersive. Yeah.
There was a Jenny Nicholson video a little while ago talking about the immersive Star Wars hotel.
Yes.
Jenny Nicholson is a YouTuber who does a lot of video essays, and this one was particularly about the failed Star Wars hotel that was advertised as being really immersive. But in this, she kind of emphasised that immersive has become very much a buzzword for Disney in their attractions, in their theme parks, in their experiences. It's a very mainstream word now that has a very loose meaning.
Absolutely. So a little bit about me. So one of the things I do is I work for a review company called No Proscenium. So we review immersive theatre. It's a little bit of poacher turned gamekeeper, where I'm just like, cool, I'll go review my contemporaries. That video got very controversial within the group because people had gone to the Star Wars experience and they didn't have the problems she was having. And people were a little bit like, well, obviously she doesn't know what she's talking about. And I kind of was like, well, I haven't been. I also enjoy Jenny. I don't disagree from what she's saying, where a lot of her complaints were, I came in with a character and that kind of confused the actors. There was an app prepared which was going to track my story. That got confused. It didn't remember. I wasn't able to keep a relationship going. Sometimes it was just wandering around, which again, all of this is massive issues with immersive theatre. And the Star Wars Hotel closed surprisingly quickly. I think it only lasted like a couple of years. And again, this is a huge problem with immersive theatre, like Punch Drunk, which I keep being like, we'll get to this. It's like, you could get to it now. So Punch Drunk being one of the big companies. Most people, if they're like interactive immersive theatre, they think of Punch Drunk. It's The Drowned Man. It's The Burnt City, which, again, in London. Burnt City should have run for like 5 years, less than 2. It's because, especially for that size of that stuff, it's so expensive. It's the space. It's multiple actors. You're getting multiple people through. And like, as we said, the Star Wars Hotel it was interesting for Disney to be like, oh, we've got like this property, we've got Star Wars, and just everything didn't seem to from that video integrate in correctly. Where it's like, oh, you
Yeah.
get to go to the park, and getting into terminology where I think it was the waders, the swimmers, and the divers, which comes
Yes.
from theme parks. So like, if you've got an audience member who's a wader, you'd be like, oh, I'm a little bit into the lore. Okay, if someone comes and asks me to do something, maybe I'll give it a go, but I think I'd rather just stay back. Swimmers will go obviously a bit deeper, and then the divers are idiots like me who are like, I am absolutely in this. Do you want me to be a character? I will be a character. Do you want me,
They're
And
usually actors themselves,
yes, the people who are like, yes.
or at least play D&D.
I think so much of it comes over because so much of it is gameplay. There was a show which is doing quite well at the moment called Mannequins, and the whole idea is they started and they're like, okay, just be yourself. I forgot that, and they said, oh, hi, is your name Shelby? And I said, yes. And we both looked at each other and were like, oh no. And then because it loops, they came back. They said, oh, is your name Shelby? I went, no. And they were like, could you remember that? And I was like, oh, the shame. But yes, so comparing it to like theme parks, let's say like the Haunted Mansion, where you could just take it on such a level, or you could be like, we're working out like the history of all the ghosts, and like with the people who are like the hosts of the Haunted Mansion, there was like an internal story, and they're like, oh yes, this is Captain Blood, and this was his mansion, and they start telling the story, and they're like, oh, the fans are picking up on this because the fans are so into the lore and working with it. Another example of sort of like long-running shows which are on in London is Phantom Peak. So Phantom Peak is like a steampunk western town, which goes for like different seasons. But because you usually get the same actors, they remember you and then being like, hey, it's you, you're back. And it's very funny when they're like, hey, so you're like a visitor to this town. And people are like, no, I live here. And they're like, no, you don't. Don't lie to me. Which is very funny. And also, let's say the divers, like myself, who are like, cool, cowboy town, I'll wear a hat. And they'll be like, nice hat. Which also is very good because then that gives you a place to hide things. A few shows where they were like, oh, no, we lost the money. And I just took my hat off. And they were like, so glad you've got that. And I was like, oh, I shouldn't have been able to smuggle that. Sorry, guys.
Are you just going into these shows looking for a way to break them?
Absolutely. A very, let's say, friendly form of chaos. And I like to play with it. I don't want to completely break it. But if you can get, like, you realise you get a smile out of the performer and you're like, okay, right, we know what we're doing here. But things like Punch Drunk, which seem to be very into one-on-ones. For people who don't know, it's this sort of idea the actor takes you aside, you have an individual scene. I literally got chased. One of the actors like held me by the hand, took me. People ran after me as if I was going to fall down. And they're like, now I get to hear the story of the Iliad.
I tried so hard to get any unique experiences, one-on-one times, small group times, hidden route, anything. I got nothing the 2 times I went. I'm so pissed. I went on a tour of the entire thing after it went down when they were doing tours. And like, and here is where you had secret experiences. Raise your hand if you experienced this one-on-one thing. And everyone raised their hand except me. I'm so mad.
And that's how the podcast ends, as Evie just flips the tape. So the one I got was Agamemnon's daughter, who's the one that they sacrificed. And so I was close. She turned around, grabbed my hand, we chased. And then we're in a tent. And for people who know Punch Drunk, you're wearing what kind of is a bit like a plague mask, sort of full face white masks. And I think this is very good when it comes to like people dressing up. You're like, that's a very clear signifier of who's a performer and who's not. And part of the rules of Punch Drunk, you wear the mask, you don't talk. So I'm in a tent with this young woman who is very, very close to me and being like, the moon forgot her daughter. And I'm just like slightly out of breath, having run up the stairs and it's hot. And she just slowly like lifts my mask up. And I'm like, oh my God, this is what it must feel like to be like in a Venetian party and be like, oh no, it's me. Oh dear.
Ooh. So I think that is a very interesting point of how close is too close. How does an audience member consent to various levels of interactivity in these things?
Oh, completely. This is such a big issue from like both sides that I hate to make it grim. All the female presenting performers I know have had an unpleasant experience working on a show. It just is. There's a lot of things I can blame it on. I'd like to say not being able to fully establish the rules where you'd be like, cool, keep your hands to yourself. Also, the alcohol. And
Yeah.
and I think answer the question that you started with, like, what is the current scene? A lot of it is for larger businesses, for like, oh yeah, this is good for team building. And some of that you're like, oh, that's great. Like at the moment, at the time of recording, they've just opened a Taskmaster show. Like, yeah, so basically it's like an escape room.
Yeah.
But the problem being the 16 people, which you go, that's much too much. And it's like, oh, who complete this task, and there's their version of little Alex Horn kind of guiding you through, and you're like, okay, that's fun. Like an escape room is a good like team building thing, but then when you're getting into like more intimate shows, like one I had friends working on was The Wolf of Wall Street, which of course brought the
The
Evey
Finance
Wylde.
Bros.
That was the much politer term that I was going to use something that banker and something that rhymed.
Oh, right, yeah,
yeah, yeah. But who, of course, I met those guys. I got friendly punched by one where he was like, "Hey, do you do acting?" And I went, "Yeah," and he just. I knew it, and I was like, "Oh no, the cocaine bro just hit the middle of me." But
Friendly punched.
friendly punch. Because that's such a sort of weird thing where you're thinking about, okay, what do people want? Another show that folks, again, promoting London shows, Bridge Command, which I'm in the video for in the bar. I'm like a historian going, well, the thing you need to understand about terror history. The fun thing with that is it's Star Trek. You get like a small group together. There's 5 of you. You're running a ship. You know, there's a bit of like people coming on board, you know, sort of diplomatic. And you're like, cool. That's the sort of thing that's very fun. You get into this idolized like space adventure. Wolf of Wall Street, you get to be a banker, and then you get to be like, oh, cool, I get to meet the wolf.
It sounds like a nightmare.
It is a nightmare. But the really funny thing is that the part of their marketing was like, hey, if you can like sell tickets, if you can get your friends to use the code, you know, we'll give you a pen, we'll give you a hat. If you can sell 2,000 tickets, you get to have lunch with the wolf himself. I was like, I don't want that.
That sounds horrifying.
And it was. And it was so very odd because you're like, I'm watching like a simulated sex scene that someone's having sex on the table. It's harrowing that you make eye contact with the actress who's still in character, but you're like... A very funny aspect to it as well was it was around sort of November time. So they had put security in, which goes into what we're talking about. How do you protect both audience and performer? So like big, bulky guys here in New York City, all wearing poppies because they still have to respect the troops, even though this is like, and it's like you'll be mid-scene and this guy in like a luminous jacket coming in like, oh, I'm just stand here and look at you. I'm like, hello, can I help you? But yes, just so much of it is being that, yes, how do you protect an audience member? How do you protect a performer? It seems so odd that you just have to keep being like, hey, don't be a jerk. Keep your hands to yourself. But it does get difficult where, like, I've had, like, my hair cut in a show where someone was, like, doing a spell and they were like, oh, can we have some of your hair? And I was like, sure. And they started doing it. And then, like, one of the actors came and was like, are you actually cutting his hair? No one does that. And I was like, hi.
Oh no. I've been to a few immersive things. And the one that's coming to mind for this question about keeping people safe is Alice's Adventures Underground.
Yes.
I went through there, and I also went through the Fantasia experience that they also did. But I believe in that there was an emphasis on, well, there was never a single performer with us at any given time. So there were multiple people to help shepherd big groups. We were split into 2, but there was very much a feeling of the audiences, we're a bit overwhelmed, we're going to look out for each other.
Yes.
Which is nice in a way, but I don't like talking to strangers. So it was a little uncomfortable. It felt like it was trying to be safe, but it was so frantic that it couldn't quite manage it on its own.
That makes perfect sense and completely agreed. As I said, like, also, as we've been talking about, like, accessibility, where Alice versus Fantasia. So Alice would be, you've been taken from room to room. You're on a set path. You're being led from, okay, now you're going to meet the White Rabbit. Now you're going to meet the Dormouse. Now, you know, so that's very set. You're on a set route. It changes depending on, I think you're given your playing cards. So you're going to get a different one each time. Something like Fantasia, which was you are wearing headphones. I think you've got an iPod in your pocket, and it's responding from the different rooms you're going into. So you go into one room and it's all icy and the music's playing, and then you go into another room and it's Chernobog, it's the end of the world, it's all scary, and that idea of like Fantasia being like a more free roam show where you're not contained, or something like The Great Gatsby that ran for a good while in London, being like, okay, so you've been invited to Mr. Gatsby's party, you're going to meet various people. Gatsby's going to take you in and be like, hey, I've got a business plan. As you said, for people like yourself who are like, cool, I don't want to talk to you, Mr. Gatsby. I keep blaming it on alcohol because I think it's such a big, but people get.
But alcohol is pushed at these things as well. Like
Absolutely.
both of the events I just mentioned, and with the Punch Drunk productions at the Burnt City, for example, they've all had bar areas with specialized drinks as like an area to go to within the experience. So it's very much baked in, and there are deals where you can get the ticket and get some drinks knocked onto that. So it's very encouraged, which was weird for Alice because there were quite a few kids that were around, and then just parties of drunk people.
I said I was talking to a friend of mine who worked on it, actually a couple of days ago, and we were talking about like at the beginning there was like an eat me or drink me kind of thing, and that was the thing. Like the drink me would be like a shot, and the eat me would be alcoholic candy, unless you made it clear you didn't want alcohol. That you inadvertently be like, cool, I've kind of done a shot before I started the show. So much of this does come back to safekeeping and protection. A few shows, Parabolic, I said, who did Bridge Command, did a show called Crisis What Crisis, which was about the winter of discontent. You are all members of the Labour Party, and being like,
no.
Yeah, no, when I went, we got invaded by America and the Russians had to bail us out. And I was there with a friend who was not very historically knowledge, and it was like, so did that actually happen? And I think I was a bit too snappy. I was like, yes, America. You remember how we constantly mentioned when America invaded us under Thatcher? But at least with them, they were like, so what we've done is we've prepared like a series of sofas. That is a quiet zone. No one is going to talk to you if you go sit on that. You can just take a moment. I kind of abused it because I was being chased by someone who wanted information, and I just walked into the area. He called me a swear word and walked off, and I was like, fair enough.
My God. One of the issues I've had is that when I want to be spoken to, no one will speak to me and I'll be completely ignored. If I don't want to be spoken to, people will go out of their way to single me out. I don't know if it's a vibe I'm giving off.
Again, being on the other side, I think there is a kind of slight cruelty to be like, that person is just like looking at their hands, being like, no, I don't want to do this. And you're like, hey, old sport, what do you think's happening in New York City? But yes, I think like I'm going to review a show in a couple of months, which is like, it's a audio dance show. It's the sort of thing is you get close to the dancers, you hear what their internal thoughts are. And the way they're selling it is, do you want to be a participant or do you want to be a watcher? And so you could either just watch the dancing or you could actually be in it. And I feel like you said, where you were like, cool, I want to have the option to be like, I would like a one-on-one, please. I would like to interact. Sometimes that is color coding. I know people do sort of like traffic light symbols, or stuff I've done in my own work is like when I've tried to do interaction, I then put a hand in the air and someone else puts a hand in the air. And then I sort of go, are you okay with reading something? And they'll be like, yes, no. One of my shows, my parents came to see, and I walked onto the stage and I realized my father had moved to the back and put sunglasses on because he was like, I didn't want to be picked on if I sat there. I'm supporting, but the fact I was like, you didn't need to wear sunglasses. He's like, well, what if you made eye contact with me? It would have been awkward. And yeah, like you said, and so much of it does come from like you're expected to play the game, and sometimes you just be like, I'm not in the mood for this. Like, say, Wolf of Wall Street, I don't want you to tell me how great you think my dick is. Which happened. You know,
I'm sorry, this show sounds
toxic.
Toxic as hell.
Yeah, it was. And it didn't run for very long, and it was a nightmare.
I guess that's what you would expect if you're going to a Wolf of Wall Street immersive experience.
Yes.
So you have to be okay with that if you're getting a ticket, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, because there was no satire to it. And I think that's the issue, like, when you're looking at, say, the film of The Wolf of Wall Street, where with so much of this stuff where you're like, yeah, these are awful people. Do we acknowledge that? Rather than being like, oh, no, the audience you're trying to catch are the people who are like, oh, I'd really like to be Jordan. Scarface. Scarface is a real man. And you're just like, oh, no.
I guess that's a question, I suppose, of theatre. Should it be made for everyone or specific audiences? Is it okay that there is theatre and immersive experiences that exist that are not for people like you and me who like kindness and imagination?
The soft sweeties
The
who are just
soft
like,
sweeties.
who are just like, oh no, I would hate to do it. Yes, yeah. I think again, sort of like using the Wolf of Wall Street, where it's just like you've got a group of people who, let's say, can't imagine complexly. Well, like I was talking to it, and they were like, "Oh yeah, we decided we weren't going to include the bit where they had the dwarf and they threw him," and I was like,
Good.
"Good." Yeah, because that happens. That happens in the book and the film. It was very funny because they also built like a swimming pool, and then they were told, "Health and safety, you absolutely cannot go in the swimming pool." So then one of the actors just came, like having obviously put a bucket of water over himself. I was like, "Hey, I've just been in the swimming pool." I was like, "No one has been in the swimming pool. Don't lie to." That said, would I probably have got in the swimming pool? Yes, because I'm just like, yes,
Yeah.
and oh my god.
You're
So
taking
what happened
being a
to
diver to a new level.
Exactly. What happened to Tom? Oh, he drowned in the Wolf of Wall Street pond. Whoopsie. I think that, Evie, that's a really interesting question about that idea of like being able to go, this isn't for you. Similar like when we get kids shows that
Yeah.
I know the Punch Drunk are doing a lot of like younger people experiences. They also did one about like Doctor Who, where it was like the crash of a spaceship. But the way they said it is, okay, we need the press in. You need to bring a child. I think the Telegraph was like, well, but I need to review it. I'm like, no, it's for children. It's not for you. This isn't for you.
I think that's kind of fair. And they could have done like a press go round that was for the grown-ups, but that would kind of lose the magic of having the children there, which I'm sure is a collaborative effort and adds a lot to it.
I think also, like, because we've talked about theme parks, same with like museums, where I know the Studio Ghibli Museum have large sections where they're like, these are for the children. You do not get to go on the cat bus. And people are like, but I want to go on the cat bus. And they're like, you are too old for Totoro to see. But yeah, so talk about Punch Drunk. I recently went to Viola's room, which is in the
Yes.
space where the Burnt City is. So that's an audio experience. You're going around in groups of 6. We got there and they're like, you need to take off your socks and your shoes. And we were like,
Yes.
have you seen it, Evie?
So I haven't. I've wanted to. But fun fact about me is if I am going to an event where there's lots of walking, I now need a wheelchair.
Right.
It's not great.
Yeah.
But so we emailed Punch Drunk to say, hey, do you have wheelchairs to hire or accessibility showings? They do have special accessibility showings. They give you a free wheelchair, and it is not mandatory for people in the chairs to take off their shoes, though they can if they want to feel the ground. So they do have the option for this, but the showings are kind of few and far between. There's like 1 or 2 a week. So it's less accessible for people who aren't fully able-bodied.
And again, this goes back to what we were saying, where, this isn't a space that's been made for accessibility. And with that, a lot of it was like, oh, you're walking or you're in sand or sections where you had to crawl. Minor spoilers, it's like you're crawling into a pillow fort, so everything's soft in blankets, which is nice. Having done other shows where I've literally been crawling through like hard wooden like boxes, and I'm just been like, this is horrible. I can feel it under my knees, and again, I'm tall and I'm bulky, and I'm just like, guys, I'll go at the end, and then there's been some very funny ones where, because I've been at the back and they've like reset a prop and I've come up with a prop and they were like, you're not supposed to have that. And I was like, and yet I do. Yes, I think that's really interesting what you're saying about like being like, accessibility for that. And
Yeah, because I wouldn't be able to crawl into the pillow fort at all. That's just not an area that would be open to me.
no. And how do you monitor that? Something like Gatsby, which was a converted warehouse where you're like, we have hard metal stairs that gets you up to the top section, and then being like, well, I guess you just don't get to see that bit. I'm like, amazing, so I don't get to see half of the show.
Yeah.
Or like you said with Burnt City, where you're like, cool, do I have to run for this bit?
When I was doing my master's in contemporary performance practices, we did a lot of participatory theatre, and something that our lecturers really stressed to us at every point was the ethics and accessibility and making sure the audience members were comfortable, to the point where I got dressed down at one point because I asked my specific audience of other theatre students to walk and jog around a room when I knew they were able to do that, but I got dressed down because it wasn't accessible to people that couldn't run. Because of that experience of studying that and making a lot of very small pieces about that, I'm now very aware of the extra little things that can be done.
Again, sort of like talking about running, like so at the time of recording, we're coming up to spooky season, and that also gets into the idea of like scare mazes and things like that, and very fun with that. We're like, oh, you're being chased. So much of that is like going, cool. You're going to get scared. They are not going to hurt you. I think it was a collab show where they were like, do not punch the actors because people keep trying to take swings at them, which gets quite funny where I like going at the back and being chased by the guy with the chainsaw and then getting it. I just went, hello. And the guy went, hello. I was like, yay. Same with like scare mazes, like going through like the London Dungeon and they jump out. And I was like, oh, good afternoon. And they're like, hey, just, it's very, rather than terror, like, I mean, terror makes me giggly, but that same sort of idea of like, oh, we're being chased by like the devil. We need to run. And I was like, there's 30 people here. We're not all going to run around in the dark.
So for a lot of performances, there's usually someone who comes in and says, this is what you can expect. From the few that I've been to, is this common practice or is it kind of assumed that you know the rules going in?
Unfortunately, fortunately, you know, it's both ways. It is becoming common practice that you need to be, which is great. It's similar like conversations about like trigger warnings, which often works at the beginning. And I personally prefer it as a completely outer world experience where you'd be like, hello, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be going around a darkened room. Please don't hit the actors. Do not actually run. These are the rules. Let's say Viola's room from the Punch Drunk, which was please don't pick up the props, which something like Punch Drunk, where so much is, oh, you need to find the secrets, or you get like, let's say the video game logic of it all, where you're like, oh, you know, there's something unique for you, and you know that you can get this. But just be like, cool, it's going to be the same for everyone. With Viola's room, where they were like, you've got your phone in your pouch, this is how you turn it on. If you pull it out, you press this button, where you're just like, you need to tell people this. And it is unfortunate, a large part of it is like, hello, these are actually people. Don't touch them. Don't try and kiss them, which there's been a few where you're just like, cool.
Of people getting way too carried away and way too into it, as if it is a LARP.
Yes.
Which, for those who don't know, is live action role playing rather than a rehearsed experience.
And again, to go back to what you were saying earlier, it's like levels of consent. Also, sort of like a good number of shows I know have like safe words. Where if like at any point I don't feel safe, the performer doesn't feel safe, we can say, like a lot of the times it's like pineapple, something that wouldn't come up of safe word. We will just stop and walk away. No sort of repercussions, no sort of, oh, you get just like it ends, which is good. But similar, like I said, with trigger warnings, I feel with Immersive, because everything is so scripted but is so reactionary, you need to be prepared for all sorts of stuff. And you also need to be prepared for people like just start crying. I've had a few times where I was like, I don't know why, and that person is just overwhelmed.
Yeah, I've been on that side of it. I've been the crier. But so on the episode where we spoke about trigger warnings, we spoke about how it's important to have them, but it can be hidden on a different web page. Like it doesn't have to be completely in your face. I'd argue for Immersive, it's more beneficial to have them up front and center with rules going in. And I think that's an exception to what we spoke about on that episode.
And I think that is, as I said, like to set it up before you go into the world and be like, this is what's going to happen. And also, because you do not know necessarily how much interaction it's going to be.
Yeah.
Is it going to be something where I just have to observe? If you're going to ask me a question, do you want an actual answer? Or am I prepared for, like in the Burnt City, a woman is suddenly just going to grab my hand and we're going to have to start running? And I was like, actually, now I think about it, like that was very clear that she looked at me and kind of like gave me a nod and I gave her a nod back. And I was like, good, that is a level of consent that we are like, cool, we've got it. And slightly sort of, you could argue a bit creepily, I'd obviously been following her for a bit because I was like, I'm interested in what's happening. Like one of the princesses of Troy, I followed for a while. And then she literally climbed a wall and disappeared. And I was like, you get slightly parasocial with this, where you build really strong relationships. And I was like, goodbye, my love.
You get so much more invested. It's very intense and personal experience, it can feel like at times, which general theatre audiences may not necessarily be prepared for if they're going into this and haven't been to many.
Again, unique things. I said like Crisis What Crisis, where one of the performers, it turns out, was working for the Russians and was trying to sell like state secrets. And he was a
like
journalist.
in the play.
No,
Okay.
weirdly in real life. And I was like, oh my God, I'm going to The Hague in a couple of weeks, Evie. I did crimes. But yes, so in this, and I was able to I was like, oh cool, this is a new subplot that's kind of unique to me. I went off, I solved it. I was like, cool, cut the ties. And I came to him and I went, I've sorted it. And he was like, oh, thanks, mate. And I went, you can go back to your family now. And he just hugged me. And afterwards he was like, I'm sorry, no one's done that. And just been like, sincerely going, you're free. I knew the performer. I was like, just getting a cuddle now. This is nice. I think this is the issue where we're sort of like going, okay, I understand completely hands off, but sometimes it's nice to get a hug or like a handshake, but also you need to have it set up rather than being like, please don't just grab. There's been a few where I've been like, is it okay for me to take your hand? And they're like, yeah. And I was like, cool, we're walking out of here. And they're like, yeah, thanks, Tom. You just walked off with our actress. And she was like, it's fine. I was like, no, we're free. We're out of the play. She gets a happy ending for, go. And then we went back into the play and they were like, do you want to keep going? I was like, we just had a happy ending. And they're like, well, happy's a strong word. I was like, I'll live in I've had my Orpheus moment. We got out of this play.
I have a few questions just to wrap us up with. The first is I wanted to take us back to the idea of structure and gamified conventions within interactive theatre. I know that kind of forum things are very typical, which is when audiences are asked to vote on a certain outcome, and whatever they vote for is the ending or midpoint action. But there are many other techniques and tropes that can be used as well.
There's a few which are more sort of gamified, let's say tabletop games, where you have a map of London, say you're part of a criminal gang, you're running it, the audience are like sending messages out and being like, oh, we need to be here. Then the audience are all recalled back in, we're around the map. Obviously, some people are working for the police, and that works against it. And that gets to an ending where it is very sort of like, oh no, it turns out the police were here. Or a lot of these endings sometimes are like, you can change the small things, but you do need a concrete ending. And obviously there's the shows, as you said, like forum theatre where you vote, or there are the more sort of small, unique, where you get your own sort of personalised endings, or ones which in the end, it doesn't necessarily, choices don't matter. That it's sort of like vignettes that you have like these little interactions, or like, again, I go back to Crisis What Crisis, where they actually got like the Conservative Party to come in and they're like, oh, I'm playing Labour. And then they really got into it. And it's like, yeah, because you're part of the story. It's not your politics.
They got the Conservative Party to take part in their production?
Obviously not like Rishi Sunak, but like members like the local MP who I think was supporting, and then like brought his fee. I think it was very like, oh, well, I'm glad it didn't happen like that in real life. And I was like, okay, cool.
That's bringing it back to politics in the 21st century.
Which again, is so necessary. And I think it sort of all comes down to, is this role-playing? Is this LARP? You know, sort of like being able to be like, is it a show where the ending can completely change and then you're coming away going that? Or is it mostly like the bigger shows where you're like, look, Troy's going to fall, Gatsby's going to die in a pool, and it doesn't ultimately change what you've done, but you had these moments, you had these interactions.
Do you think that limits the interactivity if it is very much, you can change it, but it's also very railroaded?
Yes, I think horses for courses, really, depending on what you want. Is it something that can be changed, or like say something like Bridge Command, where you are a crew of the ship, the system they have, well, I think it's mostly done by the ticket booker, and they put that information in, so when you come back and they're like, oh hey guys, last time you were here you blew up the diplomats, and that's going to change what this next show is. And because honestly people do love that, it all gets a bit parasocial, and we have to acknowledge that. And I think that's the biggest thing, where
something I will add, combining with the parasocial relationships, I'm really interested. You've mentioned Wolf of Wall Street, we mentioned Alice in Wonderland, you mentioned Bridge Command, the role of adaptation in interactive theatre, and very much putting the audience in their favourite stories and the effect that has.
Yes, so it's said like Alice in Wonderland, The Great Gatsby.
Oh, Stranger Things.
Stranger Things, yes. It seems very popular. The term immersive interactive seems like a very umbrella term that people have lots of feelings. Say like with more traditional theatre, where you're like, oh, this is Stan Stanislavski. There's a book. There's a definitive thing where we can go back and go, this is this thing. a lot of having a licensed name does help.
Yeah, so traditional theatre can kind of coast on being associated with something already established and recognizable to draw people in. But maybe for immersive, this sense of appeal needs to come from it being more adaptational, associated with something else in media. Maybe that also gives it a sense of safety in some ways.
Like I reviewed, there was like a Saw experience
Oh, that
that
sounds awful.
it's quite funny. So Nat, friend of the podcast, friend of
Mhm.
us, came along to that with me, and Nat is very brave. So Nat would climb into the holes or the dirty bathtub and like peer. And so you were put in the characters where you were like, oh, you are all millionaires. You are buying up this abandoned slaughterhouse in London because you want to turn it into flats. And your marketing has been like, oh, we're going to make affordable flats for, so the local community. Absolutely, no, you're not. You're going to build like two, and then you're going to sell it to your millionaire friends. And then, of course, people start disappearing. And then, like, the Billy puppet turns up and is like, do you want to save your friend? And I was like, oh, I just met her. And again, you watched a woman, like, getting her arms chopped off. And then it's like an escape room. And a lot of it was like, cool, put your arm in here as the blade starts coming down to hit the button. But at the same time, being like, they're not actually going to chop our arms off.
Yeah, that's kind of takes the teeth out of Saw a little bit.
Absolutely. What I would have done, and I would never get away with it, is, and again, I've started reading about H.H. Holmes, who did the basically the murder hotel. I would have said, oh, you're here for a Saw experience. It's like an immersive fun time. And then be like, oh, no, it's real. You fools, you utter fools that you think, and you, because
The H.H. Home experience coming to you soon.
yes, similarly, like, did you ever play Skyrim?
I couldn't because there are giant spiders in that game.
Absolutely fair. So, the beginning of Skyrim is kind of infamous that you pick a character and then you kind of like, oh, you're waking up. And the character across from you is like, you've woken up. They must have caught you crossing the border. That infamous meme. I have said what I want to do is make a show that you do not realize is the Skyrim show. And then you knock everyone out and then they all wake up on the back of a cart and you're like, welcome to Skyrim. You thought it, like intentionally making something that you're like, oh, this is like, you're like, no, trust him. It's not what this is.
You'd have to dress it up as being from a different video game or nerdy property so they'd get it.
Yes, where something where it's like the anagram of Skyrim. And you're like,
Yeah.
that sounds very much like the music. But something like that, okay, Saw's the perfect example here, where you're like, cool. A big problem is, do you want me to take on a character or do you want me to be myself? And I personally think it's very fun to play like, oh, I'm a cowboy. It's also quite fun to be like, I'm me. Like some of the shows I'm currently trying to work on, which like one is basically about like accidental demonic summoning, similar to what I was saying, where like, oh yeah, could you read this piece of text? Oh no, whoops. And then just seem like, hey, what? What can I do for you? And like, oh yeah, no, maybe we could play a couple of games. And not that I'm bored or anything, or not because I want to play with you. But yes, that sort of, as you said, Stranger Things saw Squid Games, which of course gets really weird if you think of the metatextuality of like, oh, you get to play games and you get to win money, and you're like, people died in this game.
Yeah, Squid Game has become a parody of itself. The first show, it did what it meant to do, but everything branching off from that is completely the antithesis of what it was supposed to even mean. Similar with Hunger Games as well, to be honest.
Hunger Games and there's sort of like again in London there's like a Monopoly show,
Yeah.
and it does what it does, and honestly folks, I'm not being dismissive of this because it is good for that. As I said, if you would just want to go to something where it's like, I get to play some games, I get to have some drinks, I get to go, oh, that's fun. It then gets very difficult when you're like, oh, we're in this really sort of intimate, quiet kind of thing, and I'm having a very intense conversation, and then someone just walks in and is like, what's going on in here? And like, shut up. Her father died at sea and I'm having a moment.
Lines very much need to be drawn of if it is of the level of intensity and the type of interaction, the type of immersion that it is bringing to the table. I would never want to go to a show and like, oh my God, it's going to be so fun. I'm just going to follow some performers around, maybe do a quiz at the end, and then suddenly get emotionally eviscerated with full eye contact. Yeah, that's a little irresponsible. So I think advertising and signposting at every stage.
But yes, as I said, I think ultimately it's very unfortunate. Now we said like to find the spaces and to also find the money. These shows do need a decent amount of money.
Yeah.
It is unfortunate that I said like where it's like, oh, we want the latest Netflix, and it's not for like an audience who can access it. It is for the people who make Netflix shows to be like, oh, cool. The guy from the anime, like the One Piece anime is here, jumping around. I got into it because I like the possibilities. I like, I said, I think the role playing, and like we are having like doing Dungeons and Dragons, where it's a mistake to think that the Dungeon Master is completely in charge. It's a mutual storytelling thing. And to be part of like an interactive show is to be like, I am part of the storytelling, but I am furthering it rather than being like, I'm in charge here, I'm doing this. And also kind of having to acknowledge, yes, you might be having fun. Are you ruining it for other people? And although that said, it is very funny when you're like, if we're going back to what we said earlier, if you're just going to kidnap the king and they're just going to be like, there isn't a show anymore, for once humanity has won against the gods. And that's,
Yeah, that is something that is really lovely about interactive theatre, is that in any kind of theatre, the audience is a collaborator in the performance. There is no theatre piece without the audience. And this takes it even many, many steps further and can be very enriching, but as we've discussed, can also be dangerous if the rules are not laid out and people do not follow them.
So you're saying I'm not allowed to kidnap the audience and take them on a big cart around the back streets of London?
Hey, if they've signed something beforehand, then all bets are off.
You didn't read the waiver. Now we've got to fight a dragon.
As long as there's a themed drink, it will be fine. Those are the rules.
Put it on the poster.
Lovely, and I think that brings us to the end of the episode. Thank you for listening. Tom, if people want to find you, where can they look?
Thank you for having me, Evie, and thank you for letting me witter about one of my passions. It's always a delight. I'm sure I'll find like a third subject I care about for the next one. Part of the family now. So if you do want to find me, I am found across social media and my website, which is Thomas Jancis. So ThomasJancis.
There's the song.
There is. And I think by the time this comes out, actually, weirdly, that demonic show I was telling you about might be getting legs. So if you want to come along and possibly see me as a terrible, like, demon guy going, I don't know, maybe we could play Jenga for a bit. Not that I think it's fun or anything. And again, if you want to see me and Evie roll together RPG, currently myself and Evie are part of a long-running campaign where we are friends.
There's a strong word for it.
We're suddenly in the same room at the same time.
Yes, we do now have two characters that are friends, which are pirates. If
you want to see what Evie and my relationship actually is like in a role-playing thing, look at the Marley rec. It's just about, even that she calls me mean names, and I'm just like, oh, you. We have a lovely time. But yes, once again, thank you very much for having me, Evie. Had a great time wittering away.
Great. As for us, you can follow us on the platform formerly known as Twitter at EPB_pod. If you would like to join the discussion, please do leave us a comment on there, or by leaving us a much appreciated like or comment on YouTube. All information sources and references, as well as some further reading should you be interested, can be found in the show notes. Thank you again for listening. We usually try and upload every other Sunday afternoon, though this is sometimes disrupted. The best way to be informed about when we post new episodes is by subscribing to us on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or Podbean. I think that's all from us for today. Have a good one. Bye!